Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Doctor, with your permission, please.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Today is the third session of this series of sessions on issues faced by Muslim youth. Dr. Shehzad Saleem is with us. We are lucky. For more information about Dr. Shehzad, please visit his website, shehzadsaleem.com. And for the recording of previous sessions, please visit our website, almouridinstitute.ca. I will not take any longer. Please, Dr. Shehzad, you can start it. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear friends, participants, and young minds. I welcome you to this third session of our Islam for Youth series. As we began, I was just talking to one of my friends that the purpose of initiating these sessions is to engage in meaningful dialogue with all of you. And if you have any questions regarding the issues that we will be discussing, some of them we've already discussed, some of them are still to be discussed. And if you would like to have any other issue added to this list, you're most welcome. You can always convey your topics to the administration here. Today we are going to discuss some of the issues that relate to global politics or the global placement of Muslims in the world, as well as some of the interactions that they generally have with their non-Muslim brethren. And this is all the more important for people and for students and for young minds who are living in the West, and they are contemplating their relations with their neighbors, with their friends, and of course with their with other people of Abrahamic faiths. So the important thing that we would like to bring up here is that living in the West is something that we have to be very careful about. We're living in countries where we have to abide by their laws at all costs. We are living in countries where we have sworn an allegiance of citizenship with them, and so therefore nothing should be nothing should come about from ourselves which is against this allegiance or this citizenship contract. We have to be law-abiding citizens, and if we think that there is something which is averse to our religion or something we don't like, of course we can always bring it to the notice of the elected representatives, but violating the law is out of question. We'll start off our session today with a discussion on the political setup which is envisaged by Islam and which we will be discussing in more detail. But before we do that, just let me discuss the issues that we're going to discuss today, the rest of them as well. So you might be seeing them on your screen. So the three issues that we're going to discuss today relate to democracy or dynasty, which is the first one, and the second one is what we call war against non-Muslims. And in the current scenario of Al-Qaeda and Taliban taking over recently in Afghanistan, this has become even more important because generally we see there are verses in the Quran which tell us to declare war on non-Muslims. And then we have this issue of making friends with non-Muslims. This again is discussed in the Quran, and there are verses in the Quran which tell us that we should not befriend non-Muslims, and therefore it becomes virtually very difficult to live in a non-Muslim country or in a Western country where there are non-Muslims, where you have people in your classrooms, in your workplaces, in your neighbors, all belonging to non-Muslims. Of them are, of course, most of them are non-Muslims, and at the same time, when we find that there are directives in the Quran which tell us from stop us from befriending non-Muslims, it does create a lot of problem and a lot of confusion as well. One thing that I'd like to clarify here is that, of course, the text which is present in the Quran has to be interpreted in its context. There are particular verses which have a particular purport, have a particular meaning, but of course they have to be understood in their proper background and in their proper perspective. So inshallah, we'll start off with these three topics, and the first topic, as I said, is democracy or dynasty, which would of course reflect the fact that what exactly is the political setup envisaged by Islam or by the Quran. So you see, when we just glance around the world, we find a number of models which go by the label of Islam, or which tell us that they are the correct representations of the Islamic political setup. So we have in Saudi the state of government which is called the monarchy, in which there is a king who rules the kingdom, and he actually nominates his successor, who is mostly from his own family, and this system goes on. So one of the models that we have today, and one of the models which people look up to today, is the model which is represented by the Saudis. And when they see, or when people see that it's monarchy based, they think that perhaps the system which Islam envisages is also monarchy. And this is especially the case, my dear friends, because you see, in our past, we have this whole dynasty being part of Islamic politics. As for example, we had the Khilafah Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphate, and then just after that, we had the Abbasids and the Umayyads, and then of course the Ottomans. And in all these dynasties, except for the rightly guided caliphate, we find that there were nominations. There were people who were nominated by an outgoing person or the outgoing monarch, and he would typically nominate his son for the next job or as his successor. So this is the first model that comes to light, or which comes to mind. And I would say that many of our religious minds, they think that this is the political setup which has been envisaged by the Quran, because after all, how can it be that so many people go against the Quran? It cannot be possible, because we have a whole tradition right from the Umayyads, from the Abbasids and the Umayyads, and up to the Ottoman Empire, which was recently dismembered a century ago. And then the second model that we have is that of theocracy. And theocracy, we can see clearly in two current states, or two countries of the world. One of them is Iran, and the other one is Afghanistan, just recently taken over by the Taliban. And both of these countries, they think that the country primarily should be ruled by scholars of religion, because Islam is an ideological religion, and therefore we have to place people who are well versed with the dictates of Islam at the helm of affairs. We just cannot afford to bring people who are not well versed with Islam at the top. And this would also jeopardize and undermine the whole process according to which Islamic law has to be implemented. And on the face of it, it looks a very strong argument that if Islam is an ideological state, it produces an ideological state, then of course people who are well aware of this ideology, only they should be at the governing position. And then we have states like, for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, some of the other Muslim states in which there is democracy, in which people are elected through a proper ballot. Of course, there are problems with this whole system. I mean, it's not absolutely transparent, and the balloting itself and the process of electing a representative is marred by corruption at times. But if you just look at the face of it and look at the principle, then the principle that is actually put forth by political democracy, and that too philosophically, would be that it's a government which is run by the people. So the people elect people as their representatives, and they run the country on their behalf. And then we also had the model of Turkey, in which there is this secularism, in which people think that religion and state are two separate things. So we should not let religion interfere with our own beliefs, because they are private. As far as religion is concerned, everyone should have his own independence. And as far as politics is concerned, we should look to various models, whichever ones we find or deem appropriate, and must not drag religion into a political setup. So clearly we can see these four options available, and there are a lot of good reasons and arguments in their favor. But the question is, which one is the one which is actually envisaged or put forth by the Quran? So just to repeat, we have theocracy, in which religion is the deciding factor in politics, as in Iran and in Afghanistan. We have dictatorship or monarchy, as in Saudi and some of the other Muslim countries. By the way, we have about 55 Muslim countries. So by and large, these four models, they are found in all of these 55 Muslim countries. And then the third model that I just talked about is the model of democracy, in which people get to elect their own representatives. And then the fourth one is secularism, which means that state and religion, there is a distinct divide between state and religion, and the two cannot or should not interfere. So now the question is, what exactly is the purport of the Quran, or is there any verse in the Quran which actually guides us in this regard? So now let me just share my screen with you and let you know how this topic is going to progress. And so therefore we will find the Quran speaking about something very, very relevant to the topic that we are just discussing. So in Surah 42, verse 38, this is Surah Shura and verse 38. The context, of course, is in the background. We have these verses which discuss what the ideal Muslim behavior should be and how they should be represented in the society and how they should have a high moral conduct. And in this regard, there is this verse which occurs within that group of verses, which tells us regarding the qualities and the traits of Muslims. And amongst them is وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ, which means their system is based on their consultation, which means, in other words, that the system has to be based amongst the consultation or on the opinion of the people. So in other words, it was 14 centuries ago that Islam actually advocated this system in which the state or the government which is elected to rule has to be run by the will of the people. So in other words, it's democracy which Islam actually supports as its system. Although the word democracy, of course, has come from a Greek origin, but then, as you can see, that the essence is the same. It is basically the will of the people which is going to decide who is going to rule. In other words, people who are elected as the representatives of people, those of them who hold majority would actually be eligible to form a government, exactly as is the case with all democracies. So we don't always have a consensus. In fact, we never have a consensus when we are talking about electing people. In most cases, what happens is there is a split vote, and ultimately it's the majority who forms the government. So in a very similar way, the Quran says that amruhum shura bainahum. And remember, it does not say amrahum shura bainal ulama, which would mean that the system of state is run on the opinion of the scholars, as is contended by people or by advocates of theocracy, like, for example, Iran or Afghanistan. It says amruhum shura bainahum, which means the opinion of all the people which are present in a society. Of course, they are mature enough to give an opinion. That is what counts ultimately. And so therefore, we find this to be the case in the first four. I would say the details, of course, can be discussed later on if you have a question, but I can describe how the first four caliphs were elected on primarily this basis. All of them represented the voice of the majority. It was only after the Caliph Ali that we find that this democracy got changed into monarchy, and after Amir Muawiyah anhu and the rest, we find the whole shift taking place, and we find nominations now taking place instead of election. So in the first, regarding the first four caliphs or the rightly guided caliphate, it's absolutely certain that all of them went through this process, although the process was more akin to political, to tribal life, because you see there was no election in those times the way we have today. But the will of the people would be found out, and the way it was found out would be that the tribal elders would be called out, and their opinion would be considered to be the representative of their tribe's opinion, and then therefore decisions would be made. So in a rudimentary form, this democracy was practiced, and it was practiced according to what was available at that time, how the will of the people could be found. So actually what the Quran tells us is the will of the people that we need to find, and this will of the people can be found out in various eras and various periods of time in different ways. And today, after so many centuries, we find a very easy way out in which there is this ballot which decides who is going to form the majority, or who actually enjoys the majority and therefore is eligible to form the government. So now the question does arise that, well, if someone is elected who might not have the same qualities that we would envisage a Muslim ruler to have, or someone who is fit to rule, then what happens? You see, the problem here again is the same, that as far as people are concerned, the society as a whole, if there is anything that needs to be reconstructed, or we would like to find good rulers who would take the helm of affairs, it's not to change the law or pick someone from the top. Basically, it is again the same thing, that you have to work on the grassroots levels. You have to educate people so that once they are elected, we find better people representing ourselves. And this would take time. I mean, it's not going to happen immediately. Just look at the mother of democracies, which is the United Kingdom or England or Britain. It has taken them about 6 or 7 centuries to streamline that system, in which for the last now couple of centuries we do have a 2-party system, or maybe a 3-party system, in which things are very smooth. But until this has happened, there was a whole evolution of things which took place. So precisely this is something which will take place if we adopt this principle correctly, that the will of the people has to be implemented. And again, if this is a question that if there is this will which has been implemented, then what about the laws which are going to be enforced in a country in which the representatives are elected or have been elected? So here again, there would be a parliament. The parliament would discuss all the laws, including Islamic laws. And once again, it would be a debate and a discussion in the parliament between people. And if any experts are needed to clarify anything that needs to be implemented which has a religious background, then scholars can be called upon and they can be asked for their opinion. But ultimately, the decision has to be made by the parliament after the discussion which takes place between the scholars, or define their opinions from the scholars regarding a particular opinion. It is the will of the majority, the people sitting in the parliament, which will become the law, as we can say. And then this minor question, of course, that I could take up is that whether it should be a presidential form of government or a parliamentarian form of government. Should we have a president or a prime minister? Again, this is something which has been left to our choice. As long as the will of the majority is taken into view, whether we have a parliamentary system or a presidential system is something that is our own choice, or can be something that should arise from our own opinion and practice. Otherwise, religion has not in any way obligated us to implement a particular system or choose between a parliamentary system or a presidential system. So the basic bedrock, I would say, or the underlying thing which religion tells us is amruhum shura bainahum, which means at all costs, the system of government must be based on the opinion of the people. They have to be consulted, and then whatever comes up has to be implemented. So it's not just the Quran which speaks of this in such a vehement tone. We have a hadith of the Prophet as well. And of course, I can go into detail, but just to cite one particular narrative that might be of interest to you. And this is something which is found in Bukhari, which is one of the premier books of hadith. And this is an excerpt from a longer hadith in which Umar anhu is speaking regarding the caliphate which was established right after the Prophet, and Abu Bakr was given the charge of the successor of the Prophet, again as a person who was representing the will of the majority. It's not that he was just nominated. It was as if he was someone who was representing the will of the majority. In fact, there was a huge consensus on his personality. So here are some of the some words of that particular narrative. It's an excerpt from that narrative. It says, "No one among you should have the misconception that the oath of allegiance to Abu Bakr took place suddenly. No doubt the oath was pledged in this way, but the Almighty protected the Muslims from its evil consequences, which might have arisen. And remember, There is none among you like Abu Bakr, whose greatness cannot be surpassed. Now, if a person pledges an oath of allegiance to someone without the opinion of the peoples, no one should pledge allegiance to him as well as to whom he himself pledged allegiance, because by doing this, both of them shall present themselves for execution. So Umar Ta'ala Anhu, of course, commenting on the situation or the circumstances which had arisen right after the death of the Prophet, in which Abu Bakr had been nominated, he was just clarifying the fact that this nomination was not just a selection, it was basically the will of the majority, because the personality of Abu Bakr was such that there was a consensus that he should be the person right after the Prophet who should rule. So therefore, it is in accordance with that this pledge of allegiance had been made. And again, the words "La khilafata illa am mashfiratin min al-muslimin" is the Arabic words in this narrative, which says that remember that no khilafah, no political system can be run or can be put into force except if it is done by the will of the people. Illa am mashfiratin min al-muslimin, illa mashfiratin min al-muslimin, which means out of the opinion and consultation of people. So we find both the Quran and narratives like this telling us that basically it's the will of the majority, it's the will or the, I would say, whoever has been elected and enjoys the majority, that should be imposed, and that is the group that should ultimately form a government and therefore rule by the will of the people. At the same time, the part in which, of course, laws are made, I've just discussed that, like the parliament, laws shall be discussed and the will of the majority would once again prevail. And when a law is passed by a parliament, it does not at all mean that the law is absolutely correct or the majority is something which always decides what is the correct course. No, this is not what is being meant here. What is being meant here is the transfer of power, regardless of whether the people elected are of the proper character or the parliament, whether the law which is passed is the correct one or not. Regardless of that, the will of the majority has to be implemented. If people think that there is something wrong with the people who have been elected or the law which has been passed, then they have all the freedom to canvass, to change this scenario in the next elections, in the next change of term, so that new people can come, and they are the ones who would be passing laws which are more akin to what people think they should be passed. So basically, it's the will of the majority which is going to decide any difference of opinion. So the difference of opinion is being decided by the will of the majority. It's not that right or wrong are being decided. So right and wrong are always to be decided by the Quran, of course, and that is something for which each of us is bound to follow. But at the collective level, when there has to be a change of guard, when there has to be a change between one setup to the other setup, then the Quran speaks about shura. Amruhum shura bainahum would mean that the opinion of the people has to prevail. So I would just now take a pause from this discussion, and before I, of course, go on to the next topic, let me see if you have any questions regarding this topic so that we can discuss it and then go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Please raise your hands for the questions, and questions from the youth will be prioritized. The first question is from Aish Khan. Yeah, how was Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam elected as a leader of Makkah or leader of Muslims? Was it through democracy?
So we are talking about the system which has to be in place after the departure of the Prophet. So this is not being governed. This verse does not tell us that this is something which is to be enforced as far as prophets of God are concerned. For prophets of God, the principle is entirely different. Their selection comes from God. And God nominates them, of course, and as far as they are alive, and as long as they are alive, and if they are in a setup as rulers, and of course they are the ones who are guided by the Almighty, and they are not bound to consult people. And here I might also add that although the Prophet was never bound to consult his or to follow the will of the majority, as so to speak, but we have instances all over Prophet's lives in which he never overruled a majority. The famous incident of Habab bin Munzir in one of the battles which were fought after the Muslims migrated to Medina was that Habab bin Munzir actually asked the Prophet that why has he asked the army to camp at a particular place? Is it because of wahi, because of a divine directive, or is it because of his own opinion? So the Prophet said it was because of his own opinion. Habab and Munzir, and then he interjected and said, well, if it is your own opinion, then you might reconsider it, because these are the flaws. If we camp the army here, we will be more vulnerable. And the Prophet actually let go of his own opinion, and he followed the opinion of Habab and Munzir. So we have several examples of the Prophet actually following the will of the majority or will of the other people. But having said that, he was not bound to do so, because he, being a prophet of God, was divinely guided. The system that we are talking about here is a system which should be in place once the Prophet departed. So it was Amruhum Shura Bainahum once the Prophet departed. As long as the Prophet was alive, for him, because he was being divinely guided, he had the authority to overrule the majority. And even in spite of having this authority, as I just said, there are so many instances, and I think we can count them on our fingertips, that they were, in most cases, the Prophet let go of his opinion, and he actually accepted the opinion of some of the other political leaders.
Thank you. Those who are watching on Facebook page, please, they can also ask question writing in the chat box. The next question is from Muhammad Soban.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Wa alaikum salam.
Sir, my question is about the ayat you have quoted, Amruhum Shura Bainahum. Sir, in this ayat, and their system based upon their consultation, and there are people who are parliamentarian and are not familiar with the Islamic values. If they are agreed to a law that is against the basic Islamic values like homosexuality, then what is there is no mechanism of interference of Islamic scholars. Then how would you explain that this is applicable to an Islamic society?
Well, this is very simple to explain, and that is, we should educate people instead of, passing laws which are, or following something which is not the will of the majority. The grassroots level education is always there. If we think that there is something wrong with the laws that are being enacted, and they are against Islamic spirit or the Quran, then the Quran would guide us to be people who are more sensitive towards other people, and instead of passing these laws or violating these laws which have been made by the majority, people should turn to the masses, try to educate them, tell them what Islam tells us. So it's not always through law that you educate people or you bring about a true society. In fact, laws are deterrent. The better way to deal with this situation is to educate people, is to let them know that why exactly does Islam, for example, as you have just mentioned in your example, why does Islam prohibit or condemn homosexuality? So it would be much more wiser if we take to this procedure and we start educating people on this. We tell them the wisdom behind this, because after all, if there is divine wisdom, why would people go away unless, of course, our own explanation is wanting? So instead of violating the law, the proper course in all such areas would be that the education, the instruction, how religion must be communicated to people, how it should be properly argued, how people or the young minds should be made to discuss and debate it, and then let them form an opinion about it, and tell them what the exact stance of religion is, not through any forceful implementation, but by cogent argumentation, by reasoning. And I would suggest, and I would also think, that if Islam is religion of nature, as we call it, why wouldn't it have the force to convince people, unless, of course, we are not presenting the proper arguments? So my one-word answer or one-line answer in this background would be that in all such situations, we have to educate the society, educate young minds, and as we do so, people who would come to the helm of affairs would be people who would be more sensitive towards the needs of religion.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Next question is from Riaz.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम डॉक्टर साहब।
वालेकुम अस्सलाम।
मेरा सवाल ये है डॉक्टर साहब कि फिक में जो है बहुत इख्तलाफात हैं और हर फिक ये समझती है कि वो सही है, तो इस मामले को कैसे हैंडल करेंगे? मतलब हनफी हो गए, मालिकी हो गए, और सब यही समझते हैं कि हम ठीक हैं।
So here's a very easy way out. The question that the gentleman has asked is that in the wake of difference of opinion which is found among scholars, how would law be made because we have so many interpretations regarding a single directive? So my answer here again would be, which I just explained a while ago, that a proper debate would be conducted in front of the parliamentarians between scholars who represent various points of view, and their own arguments would be put forth, and whichever argument receives the backing of the majority of the parliamentarians would be adopted. So this is how things should go about. The will of the majority, again, the will of the majority of the parliamentarians here would be implemented, not because they are implementing something from their own, but because after witnessing a discussion and debate between scholars who have different opinions on the same issue, people who are witnessing the debate can always form an opinion that which one of them is more convincing. So there would be a vote regarding the various opinions which have been presented, and whichever opinion is afforded with the majority vote would be implemented. Again, I would repeat the fact that this does not mean that whatever opinion is ultimately accepted is the correct one or is in line with the Quran. But what would be meant here would be that the difference of opinion, this is a forum of resolving the difference of opinion, and that difference of opinion has to be resolved in some way or the other, and it is the will of the majority that should take place in that regard. And as far as people are concerned who have a difference regarding the law which has already passed, again I would say the way out for them would be to follow the law, whatever has been enacted, and then if they think that a wrong law has been passed, they can always converse or bring people to this, that the next time there is a voting on this issue, we will have a different thing coming up, and we'll try to convince people in favor of what we think is right. So exactly the spirit of democracy will prevail in the parliament as well.
Thank you. Next question is from Umar Ibrahim.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Dr. I just wanted to ask you, with regards to the democracy from the ayah, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ, just a little thought in my mind that could it not be a case that because we are living in a democracy, that because of this atmosphere, we are superimposing the ideology of democracy that we have upon the ayah, just like other recent scholars would have superimposed the meaning of iqamat-e-din on aqimud-din, etc. So how would you answer this if you just clarify for me?
So I think the simple way out is that the Quran has been revealed in Arabic language, and it's just the language that needs to be interpreted and understood. If you have a good grasp of the language, the meaning should be derived from the text of the Quran. And absolutely, you're correct that it should not be the background or the current situation, which as a preconceived notion, we should try to read that situation from the text of the Quran. It should be the other way around. And that is, let's find out what the Quran tells us. I mean, what exactly is the meaning of Amruhum Shura Bainahum? So basically, it should be the text of the verse or the text of the Quran that must be scrutinized, that must be critically evaluated, that must be understood and even debated if it need be, and then see what comes out of it. So what I have presented is my understanding of some of the scholars and my own understanding, of course, that this verse is very explicit. It has been overlooked, and I can also let you know what the reason of this, how it came to be overlooked. But again, that's on a different debate. But without any preconceived notion, without any preconceived thought, if you just view the verse, if you just translate the verse in simple terms and understand the Arabic, it would mean their system is based on their consultation. Their system is based, amruhum, which means their system, shura, bainahum, is based on their opinion amongst themselves. So, I mean, what else could be the translation? I mean, if a person has a different translation of this verse, or he or she thinks that it has been wrongly translated, then the onus of bringing that translation or criticizing this translation is on that person. And of course, all of us here, we are not adamant on our own interpretation. If someone critically evaluates our interpretation and says that, well, this is a flaw, or there is a flaw in your interpretation and you have not taken into account certain things, and the correct one is this, then what we will do is try to examine the arguments. And if you think that we have wrongly understood, of course, we should revise our own understanding. But until that thing happens, we have to follow our own understanding to the best of our ability. So this is how I have understood, and this is how many scholars have understood, that Amruhum Shura Bainahum actually lets us know, it tells us that the opinion. So you see, the word democracy might be getting confused with the shura, the word that the Quran uses. The Quran does not use the word democracy; it uses the word shura, which means consultation. So, as a result, whatever system which comes into being, the resultant system is very similar to democracy, because in democracy, basically, it's the will of the people, or the majority of will which is implemented. Similar is the case in Shura. It says that people's will has to be implemented. If there is a single will, which means that there is a consensus and there's no difference of opinion, of course, that would be implemented. But what if there is a difference of opinion? Then, in accordance with common sense and logic, if consultation has been made and there has been a difference of opinion in the resulting outcome, then the opinion of the majority has to prevail. So this is how I understand, but at the same time, I am not in a position, or nor do I claim to be in a position that this is the ultimate interpretation. Of course, I could be wrong, but unless someone criticizes my understanding and I am convinced of his criticism, this is how things should go ahead, that people follow their own understanding.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Dr. Shehzad, can you also clarify that regarding this verse, Amruhum Shura Bainahum, how it was implemented in the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Umar, when they nominated or selected each other? Where was that democracy? And after that, for example, Sayyidina Usman Razillah Ta'ala Anhu, at that time, also the consultation, which you say Amruhum Shura Bainahum, that Bainahum among themselves was only few people who were like discussing and having Shura. So how would you clarify that?
So
please?
this is again a topic that we are going to take up in one of our next sessions, which is a much more detailed topic. So my contention here was that we should first have a discussion on the text itself, on the Quranic verse itself. How it came about in history is another thing, which we will inshallah do so in some of the coming sessions, because it's much more detailed. It's not just an answer to a question. I will take it up as an independent topic, but that would be an application of this Quranic directive. So at the moment, my understanding and my purpose of bringing it up would be that if there are questions on basically how the Quran should be understood in this verse, then they should be first discussed. Application can always, can always follow, and it will follow, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. You can continue with the next topic, please.
Okay. So we've just discussed the system that we think that Islam presents itself to, and again, with a small reminder, I would say, or disclaimer, that when we say Amruhum Shura Bainahum, it means Amruhum Shura Bain al-Muslimin, which means the opinion of all the people who are capable of giving an opinion, of course, which is in common sense tells us that immature people or people who cannot give an opinion, who are underage, would not be consulted. It would be a certain voting age, which could be fixed, and it could be different in different countries. So that's absolutely perfect. And if this understanding is correct, then of course what we now can conclude is that Islam does not support any form of monarchy. So it would be wrong for nominations to take place and a king nominating his successor and so on and so forth. Similarly, the government which is now being run in Iran and in Afghanistan at the moment, in which it is the ulama or the scholars who are ruling and who regard themselves to be capable of administering a country, is something which is again against this Quranic verse. It explicitly says that the opinion of the people has to be taken into account. Nothing can be done on them by force, or a small group of people or a minority cannot impose its will on the majority. And again, the third thing which is that I discussed was secularism. This also is something which is not condoned at all. As far as Amruhum Shura Bainahum is concerned, it would mean that the rulers should implement the will of the majority. And of course, the will of the majority is a lot of times it relates to things which are which relate to our own collectivity. For example, divorce or marriage laws or inheritance laws. There are many laws, of course, which relate to the collectivity. So in that case, what will happen is that if there is a difference of opinion, or if people think that there is a contest between contesting opinions, and the state shall intervene again. And as far as passing these laws are concerned, once again, it would be in the parliament. So it would be erroneous to believe that religion is just a private affair. Of course, it's a private affair in matters of worship, in matters of things which we think are between ourselves and God. But because of the fact that religion also gives us directives regarding collectivity, so if we leave them to a person's own opinion, again, that would be not correct. And finally, as I said, Amruhum Shura Bainahum, the Quran uses its own term of shura, and or the ultimate forum of consultation. You can call it what you like, but the word shura is used. And one last thing that I would explain here, which is quite relevant, that is something that is often talked about in Islamic circles when we bring about the topic of politics, and that is Khilafah. What exactly is Khilafah if democracy is something which the Quran talks about, or shura is something what the Quran talks about? So here again, there is this thing that I need to explain. In my humble understanding, the word Khilafah is just the Arabic term for a political system. It does not envisage any particular system. It does not envisage a monarchy or anything. Khilafah in Arabic just signifies something which the collectivity relates to. Any political system is called Khilafah. Of course, the one which is envisaged by the Quran is the one that is being talked about. But we should not have, we should not think that Khilafah refers to a political system, to a specific political system. And because of the fact that the political system that comes to our mind when we talk about Khilafah is that of monarchy, there would be a one Khalifa, one Caliph, who would be nominated, and then he would have a veto power and he could do anything that he would like. So this again is something that I'd like to humbly negate. It's not the case. Khilafah in Arabic, it simply signifies a political system. And having said that, once a ruler is elected, then he does not have any veto power. Again, he would not have the authority to implement his own will. What he'll do is, he is one of the persons who will give a vote, and it would be ultimately the will of the majority. So in most monarchies, as you very well know, it is the will of the monarch which prevails. Whatever the will of his people that he might consult would be, he would have the authority and the power to overrule, but not in the case of an Islamic ruler. In this case, he is also bound by the will of the majority. So I think we have discussed enough regarding this. And if there are questions, if they prop up later on, I will be very glad to answer them on some of the later sessions. And you can even send them via email or other means, and I'll try to answer them as well. So now we come to another very important issue relating to current scenarios, especially the people who are living amongst the West, or living amongst non-Muslims, because we do have Quranic verses which tell us that we have to fight the people of the book. Now, what exactly is the meaning of these verses? Because you see, it is the Quran which is speaking about fighting against the people of the book. And if there are such verses, then what exactly is the meaning of these verses? So let me just present before you one such verse. It's now being displayed right in front of you on your screens. It says, قاتلوا الذين لا يؤمنون بالله ولا باليوم الآخر ولا يحرمون ما حرم الله ورسوله ولا يدينون دين الحق من الذين أوتوا الكتاب حتى يعطى الجزية عن يد وهم صاغرون. Fight those from among the people of the book. Fight those from among the people of the book who believe not in Allah or the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, nor adopt the religion of truth as their religion, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and are subdued. So, a simple reading of this 29th verse of Surah Tawbah or Surah Bara, which is the 9th verse, 9th surah of the Quran. And there are similar verses as well to the effect that you have to fight non-Muslims. In fact, there are still verses which talk about chopping the heads of people who are polytheists. So the question is that war against non-Muslims or chopping off the heads of people who have taken to idolatry. Now, if these verses are found in the Quran, then what exactly is the purport? Now, just to remind you, although it's a matter of the past, but it's not that a distant past, Osama bin Laden, we know, who was killed almost about 10 years ago or a decade ago, he is someone who had declared war on the US many years ago. And even before the World Trade Center bombings, he had said, he had actually cited the Quran, some of the verses of the Quran, like this one, some other verses, which actually said that you have to fight the people of the book or to have to kill them. So once he actually cited the Quran, and he said that, look, that the Quran is telling us that we have to fight the people of the book, and we have to fight them until and unless, I mean, to this extent that they submit to us. So until and unless they submit to us, we have to keep fighting them. So Osama bin Laden, Mullah Omar, and the likes of them, Abu Bakr Baghdadi in Nigeria of ISIS, all of them have these verses of the Quran in mind whenever they are doing whatever we know that they are doing. So the question is that, what exactly is the Islamic stance? Because here it is pretty much clear, it seems pretty much clear that the Quran tells us that we have to fight the people of the book. And as Muslims, of course, we are bound to follow the Quran. And also, I do recall that almost a century ago, British Prime Minister William Gladstone, he was someone who is reported to have said in the Parliament, and he had the singular honor of being the Prime Minister of Britain 4 times. He was elected 4 times. So in one of his tenures, he addressed the House of Lords, I presume, or the House of Commons, one of them, and he said that as long as the Quran is there cannot be any world peace, because the Quran talks about killing non-Muslims or fighting the non-Muslims, and if that is the case, then how can we make peace with Muslims? And since the Quran is something which is to stay with the Muslims eternally or until the Day of Judgment, so we can never have peace, because Muslims always would be having this agenda of fighting non-Muslims. So you see, the concerns of the people around Muslims are pretty much, I would say, justified if we sit or try to understand how they are thinking. Maybe had we been in their place, we would have thought the same, that if there is a religion which openly declares war, I mean, it's not a hidden document. It is not something that people have made up anywhere. It's not even a hadith. It is the Quran itself. The Quran is telling us, fight the people of the book or chop off the heads of these idolaters. So if this is the case, then why shouldn't we do that? And why should we object to people like ISIS or the Taliban or the likes of them who do so? So this is where we need to understand that it is the Quran which at times, if it is wrongly interpreted or interpreted out of context, it leads to a very grave situation. And also we need to understand that if we have to make people understand that there is a different interpretation of these verses, then it is not by killing such people or putting them behind bars. It has to be an intellectual discussion. It has to be an intellectual exchange with people who think that the Quranic verses, the way they are interpreted, mean the way they are being interpreted. So basically, I would just suggest that this is something, the way to go about checking these interpretations is not by force, but it is through ideological exchange and by presenting the alternative or the counter narrative, I would say, or the counter arguments regarding the interpretation of such Quranic verses. Okay, now I would like to present my understanding of these verses. Of course, when I say my understanding, it's the way I have understood it from my teachers, and this is an understanding which actually owes its inception to one of the greatest minds of the subcontinent, who lived a century ago. His name was Hamiduddin Farahi, and he actually brought these verses up, and he said that there is being a fundamental mistake in interpreting a lot of verses of the Quran which talk about harshness, which talk about fight against non-Muslims. And he said that there is a very specific context to this, and that specific context actually relates to the non-Muslims, or the Jews and Christians and the idolaters of the times of the prophets of God, because they are the ones who were punished in this world for denying the truth in front of a messenger who was a representative of God. And these directives, they do not relate to later Muslims. They are governed by a particular law which is mentioned in the Quran. So I'm going to discuss that law and then make you understand how this law works in the background on these verses as well. So before I start off, just see how I would like to explain my point of view, and that is something that would be best explained if I just bring before you this small illustration, which you can see now on your screens. So you see, the religious history of mankind can be depicted rather simplistically. It could be an oversimplification, but this is, I would say, a very basic representation of the religious history of mankind. So we have a day of judgment, and we have an origin when mankind started on this earth, and that is with Adam and Eve. And then we had the prophetic era, which lasted a better part of many centuries that we cannot estimate at the moment, but it was a very, very large chunk of history. It started off with Prophet Adam and it ended on Prophet Muhammad. This is what we call as a prophetic era. And the prophetic era is governed by a particular law, which I'm just going to discuss. And then just after the departure of the last prophet, Prophet Muhammad, we have entered into a post-prophetic era, which means that prophets of God no longer come. They are no longer sent by the Almighty. So with the departure of the last prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have now entered the post-prophetic era, and for all of ourselves, until the day of judgment, we would be people who are living on the day of judgment. Now, what happens? The reason that I've displayed this chart before you, or this illustration before you, is to remind ourselves that on the day of judgment, people will be held responsible for what they did. They will be punished or they will be rewarded. So the day of judgment, as the word itself tells us, it's the judgment day. It's the day of decision. It's the day of verdicts. So a person or people shall be rewarded on the basis of their deeds, on the basis of their actions. So this day of judgment is something that tells us that all of us are going to be held accountable. We cannot escape that judgment. And accountability is something that we, in spite of knowing that we will be held accountable one day, it tends to miss, or we tend to lose sight of it. We tend to lose sight of the fact, that there is going to be an accountability, and whenever we end up doing wrong things, it is basically because the day of accountability, we overlook that. We tend to lose sight of it. We just tend to forget it. So what the Almighty did is that He created lesser days of judgments in the times of each of His messengers, in which people were rewarded or punished in this world, so that people who are living in the post-prophetic era, they can glance back and see how nations of God were punished in this world for denying the Almighty, for denying basic truths, and those who did not do so were being rewarded. So we find the nations of Lot, the nations of Shu'aib, of the Ad and the Samud, all these ancient nations which existed in Arabia, they were destroyed and the believers were actually rewarded. So there were these miniature days of judgments, these lesser days of judgments that took place in the life of each messenger of God. And the purpose of preserving this whole account in the Quran was to remind people like us who live in post-prophetic era that judgment is going to take place. Just don't forget about it. I mean, the Quran did not stop by just presenting us with this bare fact that the judgment is going to take place. In fact, it created these lesser days of judgment. The Almighty created, or He brought about these lesser days of judgment in the lives of each of these messengers of God, so that people who are living in the post-prophetic era, when they read the Quran, because all these accounts of these lesser days of judgment have been preserved in the Quran. And these lesser days of judgments are actually governed by the fact that it is the Almighty who is ruling the kingdom at that time, and on His behalf, it is His representatives who are the prophets of God, His messengers who are ruling. And they are being told that if people intentionally deny the truth, which means that it is not out of any misunderstanding, it is not out of any confusion, it is not out of any lack of understanding that they are denying the truth. The Quran tells us explicitly that مِن بَعْدِ مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُمُ الْحَقِّ, that these are the people who denied God or denied the Prophet, denied the basic truths. Once they were convinced about them, they were fully convinced about them in their hearts. They knew that this is the truth, but out of arrogance, out of some vested interest, they thought that this is something that they're not going to accept. So for such people, the punishment was implemented, and this punishment took place in various phases, in various types, for people basically who were monotheists, like the people of the book. They were given a chance to survive on their own religion, to practice their own religion, but then they would have to be in subservience of a Muslim state. And people who are idolaters, of course, are the people who stick to or adhere to polytheism. And because the punishment of polytheism on the day of judgment is that they are going to be consigned to hellfire, there is no escape for the people who perpetrate polytheism. For them, the punishment of polytheism in this world was also the same. They were to be put to death. Either they accepted Islam or they were put to death. So this is a law which was, as I said, was meant for people who existed in the times of the messengers of God, because the truth had to be conveyed in the presence of a messenger of God to such an ultimate extent that no one could deny the truth. And because of the fact that truth is something which is evident, it can only be gauged from what is in the heart of a person. The Almighty himself tells his messenger when the people have ultimately denied the truth deliberately. It's not even the prophet or the messenger himself who can take this decision that now the denial is final, now the denial is out of deliberate denial, because there's no way of knowing what deliberate denial is, because it relates to the heart. So even in this era, the Almighty tells his messengers that now that you have interacted with these people, you have answered their objections, you have presented monotheism, you have presented the true religion, if they are now denying, then they deserve punishment. The only thing is that people who are following, who are basically monotheists, like the people of the book, they'll be spared, they'll be allowed to live on their own religion, but at the same time, they have to live in subservience. However, people who are polytheists, they will not even be allowed to live. For them, the choice is either they accept religion or they don't, and they're going to they'll be executed. So in accordance with what will happen on the day of judgment, this is something which happened in the times of each of these messengers of God on these lesser days of judgments. Now, the Quran depicts these lesser days of judgments. Now, the misconception that actually arose in the minds of scholars is that when they thought that these lesser days of judgments take place in the times of every messenger of God, in which people are punished, in which people are rewarded in this world. So because we have to follow the example of a messenger of God, we are also authorized to do these things similarly in our own times, in our own eras as well. Not realizing that this is something which is only the prerogative of the prophets of God, because as prophets of God, as messengers of God, they received this divine revelation. They are representatives of God through miracles and through various other means. They are the people who are capable enough to reveal the truth in its ultimate form. None of us can claim, no Muslim preacher can claim that he or she has delivered the truth in its ultimate form. But a prophet of God, a messenger of God, he can claim that, because he's speaking on behalf of God. God is right behind him. And it is God who is guiding them step by step, that you have to first present the message, keep on presenting it, even bear persecution for it. But once a certain time elapses in which the truth has been conveyed to them, and they're still denying out of their arrogance or some other reason, then now you are no longer required to be polite with them. Now is the time for decision. Now is the time for judgment, and that judgment is now going to take place. And as I said, for polytheists, this judgment is to select between religion, between submission to God, or death. And for people of the book, or who are basically monotheists, the choice is that they can either accept the religion of truth or practice their own religion, but then they would not be in a position to be placed as rulers. They have to live in subservience. This is the law which the Almighty has destined for the nations of all messengers. Now, as I said, the error which has occurred, or the misinterpretation, I would say, or the misreading of these Quranic verses is that instead of realizing that this is just a prerogative of messengers of God to punish people or to reward them on behalf of God in their own lives, because they are basically God's messengers, because they are the ones who on behalf of God are conducting a certain mission. But in the later period, after Prophet Muhammad, this cannot be, possible. None of us is in a position to convince or convey the truth in its ultimate form. Also, none of us is in a position to find out that which of our addressees have intentionally denied. Because remember, in the prophetic era, only people who intentionally, deliberately deny are given these punishments. In the post-prophetic era, because of the fact that it is basically our own hearts, our own intentions which reflect deliberate denial, and which can only have been known through wahi, through God's divine guidance. And that no longer comes because there are no prophets in this post-prophetic era. So we can never know if a person or a non-Muslim or our addressee is intentionally denying. So therefore, we are never in a position to take any ultimate aggressive step against that person. We have to present and keep on presenting the truth and tell him and let him know that his fate or her fate on the day of judgment would be very similar to what these nations actually had and in the prophetic era. So this is in a very brief way what I have tried to explain, which the Quran tells us. Now I would like to present some of the Quranic verses from which this whole view has been understood and interpreted. So this is a basic verse of the Quran which is found in Surah Yunus, the 10th Surah. The verse is 47. It says, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُمْ قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. So it's talking about the prophetic era, the era in which messengers of God have come. It says, for each community there is a messenger. So messengers have been sent to each community. Then when their messenger comes, their fate is decided with justice and they are not wronged. Their fate is decided and are not wronged. So in other words, it would mean that every community to which a messenger is sent, that messenger is now responsible to convey the truth to that. And once that truth has been conveyed, as I said, this again would be something which the Almighty would typically communicate to his messenger through wahi, through divine revelation, that now you have preached enough, you have made your effort, you have completed your effort. These people are bent upon denying you, they are bent upon their own arrogance. Now you can just leave them, go away. The punishment or the wrath of God will visit them. And now people who are left with the choice to live would either be people who are monotheists, like the people of the book. Otherwise, as far as polytheists are concerned, they have simply exhausted their life term. And just as in the hereafter, they would be punished eternally with hellfire if they persist on polytheism, they will start receiving this punishment in this very world. So now if we understand the whole scenario in the light of this practice of God, which is specific to the era of the messenger of God, let me just once again display before you the Quranic verse that I was talking about, which speaks of waging war against non-Muslims, which speaks of killing them, or unless they, of course, accept the jizya, which is, of course, something which is a sign of subservience. So it says, قَاتِلُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَلَا بِالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَلَا يُحَرِّمُونَ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولَهُ وَلَا يَدِينُونَ دِينَ الْحَقِّ مِنَ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ. Now, if you translate this verse, it would be that fight these people of the book who do not believe in God and the law. These people of the book, of course, the Quran is addressing the people who were standing right before them. The Prophet was talking to them. They are the ones who had intentionally denied. They are the ones who, in spite of being convinced that Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet and there's one God, they had their own way and they did not want to accept this. So this verse is actually specifically talking about them, that you have to fight with such people of the book who, in spite of being the addressees of a prophet of God, in spite of being conveyed the truth to its ultimate extent, are bent upon deliberately denying this prophet. So therefore, now their punishment is that you have to fight with them. And if you fight with them, then if you conquer them, the only way in which they can live is that you impose jizya on them, which is like a tax, and then they'll be allowed to live. So as you can clearly see, that this is a verse which belongs to the era of the Prophet, because this law which I just talked about actually is related to the eras of the prophets of God. And as I said, the basic, I would say, misconception or the erroneous interpretation has resulted by actually analogously regarding the affairs of the post-prophetic era to be exactly similar to the prophetic era, not realizing that in the prophetic era, This law is specific to the messengers of God because they are God's representatives. They can convey the truth to the ultimate extent. They, on behalf of God, are punishing people or rewarding them in this world. In the post-prophetic era, the personality of a messenger, or the person of a messenger is not available to us. So in that post-prophetic era, we just cannot have the same rules which the prophetic era has. In the post-prophetic era, the era that we are living, this verse will not apply. This verse, and you ask me what exactly is the relevance of this verse if it does not apply to us. The relevance is that it tells us that people who in the prophetic era denied denied the truth, they were punished like this. And our fate would be no different on the day of judgment, because for us, that greater day of judgment is the day of judgment that we are going to be rewarded or punishment. But for nations who were living in the prophetic era, for them, their own judgment came in this world and they were destroyed or rewarded in this world. But our judgment has been deferred until the day of judgment. So therefore, when we read these stories and tales about the past nations, they are a means of reminder to us. They are a means to remind us that our fate will be no different if we also intentionally or deliberately or out of ignorance deny the basic truths. So for us, it's a point of reference. For us, it's a point of something in which we see the Quran preserving some actual details regarding the day of judgment. So basically for us, it's a reminder that we must not ever think that we are going to escape accountability. Just as nations who were nations of the prophets, they could not escape accountability in this world, and they were punished or rewarded in this world, we would also have the same fate. The only thing is that our fate has been deferred. We are not always punished or rewarded in this world. Our punishment will eventually take place on the day of judgment. The judgment has already taken place for the nations of this world. Of course, it will continue on the day of judgment. But for us, ours has been deferred. So if this particular law of the Quran is understood, I can actually let you know, or explain the fact that the second and the third point that we are going to discuss today, or we are going to discuss or have been discussing today, can be dealt simultaneously. So waging war against non-Muslims as well as befriending or hating non-Muslims is concerned is again something, as I said, is governed by this law. And because of the fact that this law relates to the era of God's messengers, so therefore we have to understand that these verses also relate to the immediate addressees, or the addressees of which were found foremost directly in front of the prophets of God, because they were the ones who had intentionally denied. They were the ones about whom the Almighty could tell the prophet that, well, this is the person who is doing so out of his own arrogance, and I am going to tell you that this is how he is behaving, and therefore you can take him to task. But today this cannot happen, because we just cannot assess people whether they are deliberately denying or not. And of course, we don't have the person of the messenger himself. So verses like befriending non-Muslims, as the case here is, and let me also read out those verses before you so that I can actually take up both these topics in a single go. I am just going to read those verses again. This is the third topic. So as I said, I'll just take the second and third topic at the same time, because both of them are governed by the same principle of the Quran. So this verse is the verse 28 of Surah number 3, which is Surah Al Imran. It says, لا يتخذ المؤمنون الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين. Believers should not make friends with the al-kafirun, leaving aside the believers. So remember, the word is used as kafir, and the kafir here, when used in this context, refers to a person who has intentionally denied the truth. It does not relate to a believer who is in a state of confusion, or who is in a state of lack of understanding, or any other thing which does not complete his understanding. So therefore, we have to understand that this does not relate to non-Muslims of today. It relates to the non-Muslims of the times of the Prophet, who were absolutely clear, who had a clear perception of the truth, and they still denied. And this is a punishment which actually the Quran talks about such people, that because of the fact that they have gone against their own word, they are convinced from their inside, and they still are adamant on denying. They're persistent on their denial. So therefore, they are not worthy of being made friends. They should not be made friends. They should not be befriended. So a very similar way is Ya ayyuhallazina amanu la tattakhizul kafirina awliya'a min dunil mu'minin aturiduna an taj'alu lillahi alaykum sultanan mubina. Believers, do not make friend with the al-kafirin, leaving aside the believers. which means that instead of befriending believers, don't go after these non-believers or these kafirs. And as I said, the word kafir, when used in this context, does not refer to an ordinary non-Muslim or a person who denies. It refers to a person who has intentionally, deliberately denied. And as I said, we can never know whether today's non-Muslims have intentionally or deliberately are denying. So therefore, they do not fall in the ambit of this verse. It is a verse which specifically relates to people about whom it can be known that they have intentionally denied. And of course, that was the case in the times of prophets of God. So therefore, these verses, as is the case with the verse which I just spoke about regarding waging war, they are basically punishments given by the Almighty through His messengers to people who are guilty of denying the truth. So basically, it's the punishment of that denial of truth which was brought about in the times of prophets of God, and which was erroneously extended into the post-prophetic era, thinking that we also should behave exactly in the same way as messengers of God did, not realizing the fact that we are not messengers, not realizing the fact that we cannot convince people the way a messenger can do, not realizing the fact that just as God communicates with those messengers and tells them when the truth has been communicated and now is the time to punish them. This is something that can never take place with people like us, because we are not prophets and therefore we have no communication with God. So in a nutshell, we can see that all these harsh verses, there are other verses as well. We can talk about some of them as well, but these are two main verses, like befriending non-Muslims and waging war against non-Muslims. They are specifically related to the era of a messenger of God, and they basically are an expression of punishment from God for people who intentionally and deliberately deny the truth. As far as we are concerned, people like us who are living in the post-prophetic era, neither are we obligated in any way to wage war against non-Muslims, nor are we told in any way not to befriend non-Muslims. It is entirely our choice. Like non-Muslims, they are, we make friends with them just as we can make friends with any other people, like we can make a friend with Muslims, because friendship is something which is now beyond the confines of religion, because in the times of the Prophet, it was something which was governed by religion, because for them, it was the ultimate, and they had to face punishment. But for people like us, our punishment is deferred. And not to speak of the fact that there are not people which exist today who don't intentionally deny. I'm not talking about that. There can be people who have intentionally denied. There are people still who out of arrogance deny. But the question is that we cannot pinpoint them. In the era of the messengers of God, they could be pinpointed because God was pinpointing them. Today, we cannot pinpoint them, even though they exist. So therefore, for us, the proper conduct would be to behave as friends, to behave as people who have the best opportunity today to exchange religion on the basis of scriptures, to read the Old Testament and to, of course, read the Final Testament at the same time, so that we have an interaction with them. As the scriptures, we need to understand they are from God. The religion of God has always been the same. And the only difference between religion, the last religion, is that it has been preserved in its final shape in the form of the Quran, whereas the previous scriptures have been altered. Otherwise, the religion that they bought was exactly the same as the Quran. And the Quran has always said, Inna Dina Indallah al-Islam, that Islam is the religion of all prophets. So the only thing is that the previous religion could not be preserved, and the last religion had to be preserved because the institution of prophethood was being terminated. So today, our relationships with our Muslim or non-Muslim neighbors have to be very cordial. It is one of the best opportunities to present to them our understanding of religion and tell them that we belong to the same faith. We are basically sects or groups of the same faith. We might be differing, but we are from the same faith. I'm talking about the Abrahamic religions. And at the same time, discuss issues which are pertinent to us, which are common to us, and discuss which are, of course, difference is always there, but agree to disagree. But in no way should we enforce our will on them. In no way can we, we are not even authorized to wage war against them. And all these Muslim groups today, which now or today they live in the UK or the US or Australia or other non-Muslim countries, in which they have an agenda that they at times covertly or at times overtly own, which is that they are going to bring about revolution in that country and change the God and change those non-Muslim rulers and ultimately implement religion or the religion of Islam is something that they need to revisit and once again reevaluate, because this is something of an objective that was never given in the times of this post-prophetic era. And one more thing that I'd like to point out here is that this does not mean that armed warfare or the warfare which Islam talks about or the Quran talks about, which we call jihad, is something that I'm saying that is something which was just specific to God's messengers. No, that particular era, of course, had that specification in which those guilty of denying the truth had to be punished through waging war. But then there is another form of war which the Quran has allowed even today, and that is against persecution, and that is against oppression. So today, if there is a Muslim or a non-Muslim country which is guilty of persecuting or subjecting its citizens to oppression, and if other Muslim countries feel that in spite of all diplomatic relations, in spite of convincing them that they should not do so, it is not desisting and it is letting loose a wave of terror, then war can be waged against it in a certain way, in a certain background, but it can only be waged by a country, not by groups, and against people who are committing, or against a country which is committing this oppression and persecution. So this was just a side explanation, because people often ask this question, that if we think that waging war is something which is specific to the era of the messengers, then is that so? And is there at the end of that? So my answer is no. That particular war related to the denial of truth. Another war is against persecution and injustice. That is still operational. However, as I said, it is subjected to certain circumstances, like, for example, only a state can wage war, no group can wage war, and then it can only be waged once diplomatic ties fail, and it can only be waged when the warring country has a reasonable chance of winning that war. I mean, you're not just going to sacrifice your own people. So that's another thing, that those conditions can be described. But as I said, that war is still operational. It is found in the Quran, and the verse which actually speaks about that is also in the Quran. I'm just going to end my talk by quoting that verse, which says, yeah. So this is verse 75 of Surah number 4. It says, وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالْمُسْتَضْعَفِينَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ وَالنِّسَاءِ وَالْوِلْدَانِ الَّذِينَ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا أَخْرِجْنَا مِنْ هَذِهِ الْقَرْيَةِ الظَّالِمِ أَهْلُهَا وَاجْعَلْ لَنَا مِنْ لَدُنْكَ وَلِيًّا وَاجْعَلْ لَنَا مِنْ لَدُنْكَ نَصِيرًا. And what has come over you, that you fight not in the cause of God, and for those weak, ill-treated, and oppressed among men, women, and children, whose cries, our Lord, rescue us from this town of oppressors, and raise for us from you one who will protect, and raise for us from you one who will help. So this verse clearly talks about the war that can still be waged against people who are oppressed, but this war cannot be because of expanding religion, or killing people for the sake of religion. It can only be for the sake of persecution and for the sake of the fact that people are being oppressed. So they have to be, dealt with separately. So in a nutshell, I can just say that this particular topic, or these two topics that I've just dealt in a simultaneous way, they relate to a particular law of God, which relates to the era of the messengers of God. It has been wrongly extrapolated in the era in which messengers of God do not exist. And the reason that law is found in the Quran is to remind us that just as the previous nations were punished in this world for their misdeeds, the same thing is going to come to us. But the only issue is that our fate has been deferred until the day of judgment. So those nations, they had their fate in this world, and we will have our fate in the next world. So we must pay heed. So basically, it's to make us realize that accountability is a fact. It took place in this world for those nations. It will take place for us in the next world. And that is what the Quran preserves. And also, it's a great blessing for the Quran, or from the Quran, that it has given us this law in the form of a practical experiment or a practical thing which took place in the times of the prophets of God, so that we can relate to it and at the same time not lose sight of the day of judgment. So I will again end my talk here, and of course there would be questions regarding this second and third topic that we have just discussed, and I'm available for them now.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. The first question is from IMJG.
Assalamu alaikum, doctor.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Doctor, so I have a question regarding, like you said that Mr. Hamiduddin Farahi explained how these verses have been misinterpreted. So my question is, why do we need like people to explain it to us? Why are the verses not made easy in the first place? Like, why do we need someone to come and explain it to us, right? Like, God is closer to us than the jugular vein. Like he can, why is it like God is saying that he's so personal, but not yet that personal that these verses are explained to us straight away? Because there is so much of bloodshed, like just because a certain verse has been misinterpreted. Yes, Doctor.
Yes.
This is
So that's a very, very pertinent and a very good question. And for this, I'd like you to refer to the whole intellectual history of Muslims. So you'll find that, you see, in the last 14 centuries or maybe 13 centuries, the way that we have interpreted the Quran is that we have seldom read the text. So what has happened is that we have relied on the opinions of scholars, which are, of course, interpretations of a Quranic opinion. And there is this era that we call the era of taqleed, or blind following, in which understanding the Quran directly from the Quran was considered as a sin. It was an anathema, and people were stopped from doing that. Even scholars themselves, for them, it was essential that they follow the ruling of their own imam. And whatever has been interpreted by that particular imam, even if a person of subsequent time or era would think differently, but he was bound intellectually to follow that person or that imam. So this was that state of stagnation of taqleed, which has given rise to what you are speaking. Otherwise, had this era of taqleed not taken place in the first instance, this would never have arisen, and people would have continued to benefit from the Quran directly by understanding it and trying to make sense out of these verses of the Quran. But because they were made to stop exercising their own understanding and their own intellect, because people thought in the 3rd or 4th century that all kinds of interpretation are springing up, and this would cause a lot of dispersion and a lot of disorganization amongst people, and they'll create a lot of fitna and a lot of mischief. So the creed of taqleed was introduced, and it stopped people from understanding the Quran itself. And in fact, it was then that the Quran ultimately ended up as a book which was just read for the sake of giving reward to the dead or for other reasons, and it was never read for understanding, because as I just explained, understanding had been already taking place in the times of the previous scholars, and that had to be relied upon. So this brief introduction to the religious history or the intellectual Muslim history, I think, tells us why that people like Hamiduddin Farahi, and he's not the first one. I mean, there were people even before him, but there were very few, and some of them became prominent, some of them did not, and they were always these sparsely placed people. So he was someone who, when he made these statements, and he vehemently said that we have lost track of the Quran itself, and we have started to follow the interpretations rather than the Quran himself, and the way that he convincingly presented his thesis, that it impacted a lot of minds. And after his departure, we see his students and the students of his students doing the same and carrying on this in the same veins in the last 100 years. So it's like, I mean, it's an opportunity which God has created, and somehow it is still carrying on. Otherwise, it may well have been that he would have died in oblivion, and there would have been people who would just not have known him. But somehow, whatever he presented as a thesis started to impact people, and people of the next generation. And this is how, I mean, it's naturally coming forth.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Nazli Harun asks that this is understandable that we can make friends, non-Muslims, but we should be cautious that making them close friends can influence, friends influence friends. So how would you see that?
So I think that what would be influence? I mean, the influence that we can really get from them is good morals and being good human beings, and that is something that we can find in most non-Muslims. I think it's a very desirable thing. The only thing that we differ with them, of course, is that our own concept of Jesus, if you're talking about Christians, or our own concept of worshipping the Almighty. So we have our distinct ways of worshipping them. If we are confident on our own religion or the way that we practice religion, I don't think there's cause of any alarm, because I think the biggest thing that impedes this social exchange is this concept of fear that we have. What have we to fear about? I mean, we should just give up fearing the other, as I would say. I mean, we have to be confident of our own view. At the same time, also realize that we could be wrong. So there could always be a correction. So if we place ourselves on a humble pedestal in which we think that we can be wrong and we would like to understand things from other people, we can always look for good points from them. At the same time, try to present our good points to other people and remain humble that we can be wrong. So I think that would be that is how we can overcome the fear factor that is now plaguing a lot of people who live in the West, and they fear that somehow their young minds will fall prey to the understanding of other religions. I think we have to be bold here, because if there is any strength in the truth, why shouldn't we rely on that strength instead of being scared of it?
Thank you. Riaz, you can ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Sahab.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Dr. Sahab, in prophetic era, the punishments, they came in the form of rain or the earthquakes. In the post-prophetic era, we have the rains and also the floods and the earthquake. Is it the punishment from God, or we can call it just the law of nature?
So in the post-prophetic era, these calamities, these natural calamities, they come to caution and to prod us. They are basically trials of God. They are not the result of our evil or good deeds, which again is a misconception. If there is a calamity, we think that it is a result of our own bad deeds. It's not necessarily so. In most cases, they are a means of trial of. They are trials of God. The Almighty has said that He'll try all of us. He'll put us through various tests. So these calamities like earthquakes, floods, etc., fires, they are all forms of trials and tribulations. But in the times of the messengers of God, they were not just merely trials and tribulations, they were actually punishments. Because, as I just said, in the prophetic era, the Almighty has taken upon Himself that He will punish people in this world. So the word used by the Quran is Kataballahu la'aghlibanna ana wa rasuli. In this world, I and my messengers in their times have to prevail. But in the post-prophetic era, there's no such rule. So in this era, if there are calamities, these natural calamities, they are not because God is intending to punish or reward individuals, but because they form a larger scheme. They are part of a larger scheme of trials and tests that the Almighty wants us to go through.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Zareen Qasim, you can ask your question.
So, sir, like for example, if there is a person or there is even like a country that intentionally denies the truth about Islam and everything. So, if that country or that person even is not like threatening us in any way or persecuting us in any way, so is it necessary for us to wage war against them? Because like Islam did say to wage war against those who intentionally deny the truth.
No,
But if they are not
yes, I get your point. There are two conditions. When intentionally deny the truth which has been unveiled by a prophet of God in whose era they existed. So the whole thing is not just denial from something which was delivered to them by a messenger of God right in front of them from God. So it was the presence of the messenger which actually made this whole situation grave. One thing. And the other thing is that today we can never know if a person is intentionally denying, unless, of course, he expresses it from his own tongue. Because in the times of the messengers of God, as I said, the Almighty, even the messenger would not know that a particular group is intentionally denying or not. The Almighty would communicate to him that now the time is up. Now you should leave that nation. Earthquakes and cyclones will visit them and destroy them. Now their time is up. So even in the times of those messengers, it was the Almighty who told those prophets that intentional denial is taking place. So in our period of post-prophetic era, number one, those messengers don't exist. They cannot exist. So therefore, deliberate denial is not even talked about here. And second thing, even if it is talked about here, deliberate denial can never be gauged, because we are not in a position. All we can do is judge people from their outside. We just cannot know what is in their hearts. Deliberate denial is something which relates to the heart. It relates to your own inner perception. And that is something which only the Almighty knows. In the times of His messengers, He communicated it to His messengers so that they could implement a certain act, a certain punishment. But today, that intentional denial, even if it is there, cannot be divulged. We cannot know it.
Sir, I'm just saying that, for example, if a country openly declares that we don't accept Islam and we are intentionally denying it, just supposedly. So, in that case, if that country is not threatening like our country, like Pakistan, for example, so then is it all right that we wage war on them because they are intentionally denying?
Certainly not, because you see, even if they openly deny God, or they openly, out of their own arrogance, this this is a law which just relates to the era of the messengers of God. Today, waging war for denial, which is called kufr, is something that can not be done. It was a prerogative of the messengers of God only. So even if today there is someone who, declares that we are openly denying the religion of God and we will not accept it, even then we are not authorized in any way to punish them or wage war against them.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Abdul Wadud asked that please explain punishment for people that denied Jesus, if any, in his time.
In his times, his own times.
Yeah, in his own time.
So the Quran has actually clarified that, and it says that وَجَعَلُوا الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوكَ فَوْقَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. The people who would deny Jesus would be ultimately subservient to people who are going to accept him. And this happened. We know that Jesus passed away somewhere between 40 and 50 AD, and in just about 20 years or so, Titus Rumi actually wreaked havoc with Jerusalem, and he destroyed the temple, and that punishment came actually. So for such people, the denial was there, and they actually were subservient to the denials were subservient to those who had followed him.
Dr. Shehzad, before I request you to summarize your today's talk, I would say that we were waiting for LGBT interaction topic and dating and sex education. So are we having these sessions and these topics in next sessions?
Of course. As I said, we have already circulated the content of the course, which is you can see on the website. Mm-hmm. So all of them are going to be dealt with, but as I said, they are going to be done so in a way that we are able to discuss each of them in a way that the time that is needed for each of these topics is totally consumed, and so all these topics will be discussed in their own turn.
Thank you. For more information about Dr. Shehzad Saleem's work, please visit his website, shehzadsaleem.com. And for the recordings of previous sessions, you can visit almouridinstitute.ca. And for the follow-up questions and discussions, you can join our WhatsApp group. Sean Sheikh has just copied the link here. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Shehzad. And we have a last question here.
Okay.
Go ahead, IMJ.
Doctor, so this is one question I think it will help everyone. We have a lot of audience who are also from the West, so I think this will help everyone. Doctor, mm-hmm. So this is regarding the divinity of the book, right, of the Quran. Are this the Quran standing the test of time for 1,400 years, or the eloquence, or the lately deduced mathematical patterns? Are these the only way for us to know that the Quran is the word of God? Because there have been a lot of discussions that, whenever there is a debate that just gets on, they say that only these three things are mentioned, that this is the word of God and not anything else, right? So what do you have to say about that, Doctor?
I'll just say what the Quran talks about himself. It says that there is one difference between divine word and divine book or divine discourse and human discourse, and that is لو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا, which means that divine word is without any discrepancy. It does not have any contradiction. Whereas humans, whenever they form an opinion, you can just see all kinds of people who are even geniuses like maybe Einstein or Marx or Kant or even Stephen Hawking, that they formed a certain opinion, they changed that opinion, and there was a certain evolution. And ultimately they ended up with an opinion which of course could not necessarily be correct. So there was a whole evolution of thought, and there was a whole journey in which things were accepted or rejected. The Quran says that there is no discrepancy in its message from day one. There is no evolution in its message. It is something which is always plagued by human discourses in which there is an evolution. So you will not find any discrepancy, any evolution, any change in the stance of the Quran. It said exactly the same thing the time that it was revealed, and it said exactly the same thing at the time that it was, I mean, the revelation was finished after 22 years. So there was absolutely nothing in these 22 years which can be pointed out, as is the case in other people's lives and their own discourses, in which they go through a whole exercise of acceptance and rejection, and they do this until they reach a certain opinion, and even that opinion is not necessarily correct. So this is what the Quran tells us, that there is no discrepancy, and the difference between human words or human books and books sent down by the Almighty is that they are free from discrepancies and contradictions. And I think the Quran has stood the test of that. And in spite of that, I know that there are people who have presented those discrepancies and inconsistencies, which seemingly seemingly look as if they are inconsistencies. But I think a deeper look would reveal that they are not inconsistencies. They have been erroneously understood to be inconsistencies.
Thank you. We still have some time. Please ask a question, Mariam.
Hey, Dr. Saleem. So there was a question in the chat. The participant asked that they're they're bisexual Muslims, and they're wondering what to do about their bisexuality. So they're currently not attracted to anyone, but they're worried in the future they might fall for someone.
So I can go and answer this question, but I would just request them to just hold on to their question, because sexuality and sex education is something which is going to soon come up as a independent topic, in which we're going to thrash it out and discuss it in much more detail in one of the coming sessions, inshallah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you for your time, Dr. Shehzad. You can summarize today's talk.
So inshallah, next time we'll come up with some new topics. We've just discussed the issue of global politics and Islam, and discussed and seen how the shura, the word used by the Quran is shura, which means that the system of politics or political system that Islam envisages is consultation, which exactly is the same as democracy. The words are different, but the intention or the spirit is the same. So it would the right system which Islam envisages is actually reflected in the Quran, and although it might not be adhered to by many Muslim countries today, but that's not the responsibility of God in any way. People are free to choose, but the one that has been prescribed is based on the opinions of people. And we have then discussed 2 points that relate to a very important and a phenomenal law which is mentioned in the Quran, relating to only the messengers of God, and which cannot be extended beyond them. And that is that people in the times of messengers of God are punished in this world for their intentional denial. And this punishment has various forms, but this punishment has got nothing to do with people who are not the foremost adversaries of these messengers and who are living in the post-prophetic era. So, of course, this is something of it might be something new for many of you, but as I said, the purpose of these talks and these sessions is not to convince you of a certain point of view, but to present before you the arguments in favor of that point of view, and to provoke you maybe, or to tickle you to come out with your own questions, or even criticize the views which I have presented here, so that we can enter and engage into a meaningful dialogue, and in which we are able to discuss religion freely, and there is no such thing as a taboo topic. So until next time, it is Khuda Hafiz. Thank you.